Hi everybody, today's topic is your story. I wanted to have a quick chat with you today about the importance of our stories. It's one of the things that we see when people come into counselling rooms or even just coaching. You know, the first thing we do is we actually get them to tell us their story. And it's always been really interesting to me when you go to like a group training session and they do the icebreaker and everybody goes around the room and introduces themselves and, you know, they give a little bit of a blurb about themselves. It's always such an insight when people share their story because, you get some idea of how they're identifying with themselves. So, you know, it might be something along the lines of, you know, I'm a mother of four, or, I have such and such a qualification or a degree, or it might be, an activity that they like to do in their spare time that they identify with. All of those things are indicators. They're our stories, you know, the things that we do, that our identity is wrapped up in. And the reason why I wanted to have a chat with you today about stories is because we all have the power to create or change our stories. Sometimes those stories are positive, so, you know, we might put a positive slant on it. I might have a chronic illness and my story might be that, you know, if it weren't for that illness, then I wouldn't have discovered how to really live, or I wouldn't have gotten my weight under control, or some other, maybe their stress or something along those lines. So, you know, sometimes people identify with their story in a positive way. To take that same example and say, for instance, I have a chronic illness, therefore I can't work, or I have a chronic illness, so therefore it's hard for me to do things, you know, I can't travel, or I can't do the things that I would like to do, I have no energy, you know, that kind of thing. So there's two different ways of looking at it. And, you know, our stories can both be a huge way that we make sense of the world. You know, they are the descriptors. They give context to the decisions that we're making. And, you know, we justify our actions, I guess, through those stories. But something to be very wary of is if we're using those stories to actually excuse our behaviour or to make excuses for not doing things that we know we should, then the story becomes detrimental. You know, the story isn't adding a positive aspect to our life. It's actually allowing us to stay small or to not do the things that we know that we should do. And you see lots of people who use their story in that particular way. And I'll give you an example of that. So it might be that, perhaps I'm not very connected with my partner. Perhaps I'm not making any effort to be connected with my partner. Perhaps, the excuse that I might use is that, you know, I always have to go first. I've always got to do the work and you're never willing to do the work. It's not reciprocal, so I'm not going to try. Or the story might be, I have childhood trauma, and so it's unreasonable of you to expect me to do those things, for my behaviour to be the way that you would like it to be. That's unreasonable because I have trust issues, and I have trust issues because of my childhood. And you can see how the story then becomes an excuse for not dealing with ourselves, or as I like to put it, not doing the work, you know, a reason or an excuse for not doing the work. It's not even a reason, it's an excuse. And so this is an example of when our stories are actually to our detriment. Now, the reality is every single one of us has a story. You know, my story could be that I lost everything in a fire 10 years ago, and so I don't, I don't have a lot of possessions. Or my story could be, you know, that fire 10 years ago was the best thing that ever happened to me because I'm not weighed down by a lot of possessions. So you choose how you interpret your story, but it's very important that we consider and understand that we don't use that story as an excuse for not doing the work on ourselves that we need to do, or for behaving badly, or for making bad decisions, or for staying stuck in the one place. So story is hugely important because we identify it with it. That's how we identify ourselves. But, you know, if we tell ourselves a story that's not, for want of a better word, I guess, doesn't serve us, then it holds us small, and, you know, that's obviously not a good place to be. So beware the story, you know, challenge your stories. You know, what story am I telling myself? What's your story? And listen to other people's story, because one of the things that I have discovered is that toxic people in particular will often tell you a lot more about themselves than they realize in their story if you're just listening. And, you know, the story we might be telling ourselves is that, you know, we're empathic people, we're kind and we're caring, and we just want to give that person a chance. And that story obviously can trip us up. So, you know, be very wary of the story. Use it for positive, to create a big, beautiful, juicy life. Don't use it to keep you small. And that's all I've got to say today. Now, if you would like to have a copy of our 30 Days of Connection, then pop over to my website, liminalcoaching.com.au, and fill out the details there to get the free program, 30 Days of Connection. We also show this on YouTube. You can pick up the article on LinkedIn, and of course you can listen to it on SoundCloud if you'd prefer to do that too. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you later in the week. Bye.